Peter, free will is a marvelous probe of mental states, consciousness, and I've been obsessed with it. But so many different people give me all these different ways to think about it, it gets confusion. I'd like to have you tell me, how should I think about the problem of free will?
Well, I can only give you my own opinion on the problem of free will. There are a lot of philosophers have looked at the problem of free will in a lot of different ways, or maybe I should say they've used the words, the problem of free will, in a lot of different ways. I'll tell you how I see the problem, or even better, what I mean by the phrase, the problem of free will. And I'll start with just free will. I think I would say that a person has free will let's imagine a person called Sally, say, who's trying to decide whether to accept an offer from Juilliard to study piano or an offer from Harvard to law school to study law there. And she really wants to be a pianist and she really wants to be a lawyer and she can't be both. And she spends the whole month of January trying to decide which offer to accept. I would say that she has free will in this matter if she's able to accept each offer. That is, if she's able to accept the Juilliard offer and able to accept the Harvard offer. Of course, that doesn't mean she's able to do both. It means that she's able to do each. That's what free will is. The problem of free will arises from considerations having to do with determinism. Determinism is a philosopher's term of art. And it means this, that determinism is the thesis that the laws of nature and the past determine a unique future. In other words, if you get to a certain point in time, given the laws of nature, there's only one way for the world to go on. Only one possible future leads away from that present. The foil of determinism is indeterminism. That is, that says there's more than one way the world could go on. In other words, if you can imagine God moving the world back to some point in the past, say where the world was on January 1st, 1991, it might go on the way it did, or it might go on some other way. Both of those would be perfectly possible. That's indeterminism. To my mind, the problem of free will arises because it seems that free will is impossible if determinism is true, and it seems that free will is impossible if indeterminism
How so in
is
either
true.
case?
Okay, well, let's suppose that Sally decides to go to the Harvard Law School. Was she able to make the decision to go to Juilliard? Well, since she did decide to go to the Harvard Law School, if determinism is true, that was the one possible future. If she decided to go to Juilliard, she would have had to have made a decision that simply didn't occur in the actual course of events. Either the laws of nature would have had to have been different, or the past would have had to have been different, and that's just not possible. When you get to this point in time, the past is done. Our freedom, as Carl Janaea said, is just freedom to add to the past that has actually happened. And we can't change the laws of nature. So there's nothing she could have done but make the decision that she did make. On the other hand, suppose that there were these two possible futures, one of which she goes to Juilliard, one of which she goes to Harvard. Well, it looks as if when she comes to this fork in the world, it's just a matter of chance which way things happen. She can't have any control over which future she goes into. If she might go into one, she might go into the other. If you knew that it was just a matter of indeterministic chance, which thing you would do at a certain point in time, you wouldn't be able to promise to do one or the other. You would just have to wait and see what would happen. So it looks as if free will is incompatible with determinism on the one hand and incompatible with indeterminism on the other hand, so it must be impossible. But if it's impossible, then, well, suppose I want to blame somebody for something. Certainly it seems to us that certain things that have happened in history are somebody's fault or that somebody is to blame for them. Well, that implies, I suppose, that instead of something they did that brought those things about, they ought to have done something else. But to say that they ought to have done something else implies that there was something else for them to do, and that means that they were able to do that other thing. And if they weren't able to do that other thing, then how can we blame them for doing the one thing that they were able to do? So it looks as if free will is impossible, and fault, or blaming people, or saying things are people's fault, or saying that things are things that people ought not to have done, that these are impossible. But it's just nothing could be more obvious than that some things that have happened in human history are the fault of some people, that they're to blame for them. Nothing could be more obvious than that people sometimes do what they ought not to do, that we rightly judge that. So somewhere in all this reasoning, there is a mistake. And I want to say that the problem of free will should be specified this way. Where is that mistake? Because we've come to absolutely contradictory conclusions. They can't be true, so there has to be some fault in the reasoning. I call the problem of free will a mystery simply in this sense, not necessarily because it surpasses human understanding, but simply because nobody has a plausible candidate for where this mistake was. There have been such cases in the past that got resolved. At one, Zeno, for example, had arguments for the impossibility of motion. I think 2,000 years ago, nobody was in a position to say what those faults were. It was a mystery. Now, I think we know how to locate the faults. Galileo thought that he had an argument that showed there couldn't be an infinite number of stars. The argument was just wrong, but even a great genius like Galileo couldn't see the fault. I hope that somewhere in this argument we have a fault that is discoverable like those. On the other hand, as Noam Chomsky has speculated, maybe our minds are just put together in the wrong way to find this fault. We got a certain set of cognitive modules tossed up to us in our evolutionary history. Maybe we got the wrong ones for thinking about this problem. That's a depressing thought, but we can't rule it out.
Take me through your own personal journey on this, because you've played a role in making incompatibilism, where the free will is impossible under a condition of determinism, respectable again, because prior to much of the work you've done, most philosophers were so-called compatibilists, believing that even though the world has been completely determined, there is a kind of free will.
Yes, there was. In the history of the problem of free will, and particularly in the Anglophone countries, there has been a long tradition of very able, very great philosophers saying that you can have free will in a world that was completely deterministic. Hobbes, Hume, Mill, all said that you could have what they would have called liberty, mostly, even though your actions were the inevitable causal consequences of past events. And of course, they said maybe you can't quite have the liberty that you thought you had, but you can have something that should be called liberty, and it's all you should ever have wanted. This view was less popular on the continent, where Kant called what Hume offered as liberty a wretched subterfuge. But the question is then, first of all, what do we mean by liberty or freedom or free will, and is it indeed compatible with determinism? Suppose it means this, that you're both able, when you're trying to decide between two alternatives, you're able to do both of them, at least sometimes. A compatibilist is someone who says, even though it's completely causally determined that you were going to decide to do A, you were able to do B. Why? Well, maybe being able to do B means something like this. If you had decided or tried or set out or willed or wanted, if something had been different, then you would have done B. And that's all we want, right? You're in the prison cell, you can't leave. Why are you not able to leave? Because if you tried to leave, you wouldn't. You'd fail. You're unable to quit smoking. Why? Well, because if you tried, you'd fail, and et cetera. And they said, that's all we ever mean by if-then. That was the standard view for a long time. The compatibilist view, standard in the Anglophone world. There were exceptions. Not everyone believed that, but that was the exception. And I remember the first time this view was pointed out to me, and I said, but wait a minute. I said, if my actions are the inevitable causal consequence of the past, look, I'm not able to, I don't have any choice about what went on in the past. And I don't have any choice about what evolved out of it according to the laws of nature. I can't work miracles. I can't change the laws of nature. So I don't think that's right. I don't think I can do this other thing. And people would tell me I was just naive and wrong. But so I've tried to formulate this kind of argument.
You were a graduate student at the time.
I began as a graduate student, but then as a young faculty member, people kept telling me I was wrong. Referees at journals kept telling me I was wrong, because this was settled. This was well known. This was a philosophical discovery that free will was compatible with determinism. The belief that free will was incompatible with determinism, this was a layman's false belief that philosophers had seen through. I had to work very hard to convince philosophers that that was wrong, and I think probably I didn't so much convince individual philosophers that it was wrong as convince new graduate students coming up through the ranks that it was wrong. And this way the arguments gradually gained some influence. But this was only one side of the problem of free will, because simply to show that free will is incompatible with determinism is, well, it's really to pose the problem in a much more pressing form, because there are also good arguments to show that free will is incompatible with indeterminism, which would make it impossible, which would make moral responsibility impossible, people thought. And so I have tried to work on this problem, to put all this together, to find the place that allows both free will and moral responsibility in a world that's certainly either deterministic or indeterministic for more than 40 years now. And I confess myself just baffled by this problem. It is too difficult for me. I hope that someday somebody will discover where the loose thread that can be pulled that will cause the whole thing to come apart and release us from this problem is, but I certainly don't think that I've found the loose thread. I don't think that any living philosopher has found the loose thread. If it is solved, it will be solved at some point in the future.